Kiana Marshall trudged down a cracked Birmingham sidewalk, counting crumpled dollar bills under flickering streetlights, her sneakers scuffing against the asphalt after a brutal late-night shift. At a greasy diner, sweat beaded on her forehead in the 90-degree heat as she dreamed of studying astronomy at Tuskegee University. Suddenly sirens screamed, and a police cruiser screeched to a halt. Officers leapt out, guns drawn, shouting slurs and accusing her of a murder 3 streets over. Her tips scattered as cuffs bit her wrists, promising a future now stained with lies. What happens when innocence becomes the crime before we dive deeper? Let everyone know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice, give this video a like and hit subscribe, because tomorrow's special episode will unravel a twist you won't see coming. Stay tuned for a story that demands to be heard. Kiana Marshall sat shivering on a cracked plastic chair in the Birmingham precinct, her thin t-shirt clinging to her sweat-soaked skin. After the cops had confiscated her denim jacket, the air reeked of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, the kind of smell that stuck to your clothes and never washed out. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the peeling grey walls around her. 2 officers stood by the door. One of them, a wiry man with a buzz cut and a smirk that made her stomach twist, kept muttering slurs under his breath, calling her trash and worse, while the other, a younger guy with a nervous twitch in his eye, avoided looking at her altogether. She clutched her elbows, trying to hold herself together as the reality of the night sank in like a stone. Her wrist still throbbed where the cuffs had bitten deep, leaving red welts that stung with every heartbeat. She replayed the moment over and over, the flickering streetlights, the scream of sirens, the officers, guns gleaming in the dark, accusing her of a murder she couldn't even fathom. Committing her alibi was solid. She'd been at the diner all night, scrubbing greasy plates and dodging rude customers for 10 hours straight. Her time card would show it. Her manager, Big Ray, would vouch for her. Even the security cameras above the cash register would have caught her every move. But the cops didn't care about any of that. They hadn't even asked her side before hauling her in like a trophy there. Voices echoed in her mind now. "Hands where we can see them, get on the ground, murderer." The words stung worse than the cuffs, because they weren't just wrong. They were impossible. She'd never even held a knife, let alone used one to kill someone. But here she was, locked in a concrete box, while the world outside spun on without her. The wiry officer, whose name tag read Detective Lamar Stokes, finally stepped forward, his boots clicking on the scuffed linoleum floor. He tossed her backpack onto the metal table in front of her, the zipper half broken from when they'd ripped it off her shoulders. He smirked again, his yellowed teeth glinting under the lights, as he pulled out a bloody kitchen knife, its blade smeared with crimson that looked too fresh to be real, and dropped it into a clear plastic evidence bag. "This yours?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock curiosity. Her stomach lurched at the sight of the knife. Her voice came out shaky but firm. "No, I've never seen that. Before I was at the diner all night. Checked the cameras, talked to my manager." Stokes laughed, a low guttural sound that sent chills down her spine as he leaned in close enough for her to smell the tobacco on his breath. "We already got a witness who saw you stab that poor shop owner 3 streets from where we nabbed you, little lady. You're done." He straightened up, tossing the bag to the younger officer, who caught it with trembling hands. Stokes pulled a crumpled sheet of paper from his pocket and unfolded it slowly, making a show of it like he was savoring the moment. "Witness statement," he said, waving it in front of her face before slapping it down on the table. "Says you were seen running from the scene covered in blood. Matches your description." To a T, Kiana's heart slammed against her ribcage as she stared at the paper, the words blurring through the panic fogging her mind. It was a lie. Every word of it. She hadn't been anywhere near that shop. She didn't even know where it was. But Stokes wasn't done. He kept going on about how the shop owner, a white guy in his 50s, had been closing up when she supposedly jumped him, stole his cash, and left him bleeding out on the sidewalk. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to speak. "I didn't do this. I swear I've been working all day. I've got proof." But Stokes cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Proof?" he snorted. "You think I care about your little diner story? We've got evidence. We've got witnesses. You're just another thug trying to play innocent." His words hit like a punch to the gut, each one laced with venom that made her skin crawl. She wanted to scream to demand they check her alibi, but the look in his eyes told her it wouldn't matter. He wasn't here to find the truth. He was here to bury her. The younger officer, whose name tag read Jenkins, shifted uncomfortably by the door, his fingers twitching at his side, like he wanted to say something, but didn't dare. Stokes ignored him, turning back, to Kiana with a grin that made her feel like prey caught in a trap. "Let's see how you explain this in court," he said before stepping back and barking at Jenkins to get her processed. Kiana's mind raced as they dragged her down a narrow hallway, her sneakers squeaking on the floor. They fingerprinted her, the ink staining her trembling fingers black, then photographed her, the camera's flash blinding her as she stood against a grimy height chart. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall, not here, not in front of them. They shoved her into a tiny room and searched her, stripping off her t-shirt, to check for hidden weapons or drugs, leaving her shivering in just her undershirt as they tossed her clothes into a bin. Finally, they threw her into a holding cell, the door slamming shut with a clang that echoed in her skull. 3 other girls sat inside their faces, blank and tired. One of them, a skinny girl with a scar across her cheek, glanced at Kiana before looking away. Nobody spoke. The air was thick with despair and the faint smell of bleach. Kiana sank onto the cold metal bench. Her knees pulled to her chest as the weight of it all pressed down on her. She needed to call someone, anyone. Her mom Elise would know what to do. She'd fight for her, but the hours dragged on with no word, no phone call, nothing but the buzz of the lights and the occasional shout from down the hall. Finally, during a shift change, she spotted an officer walking past his badge, gleaming under the fluorescence. "Don't I get a phone call?" she asked, her voice cracking from disuse. He sneered, at her, his lip curling like she'd asked for a 5-course meal. "You'll get one when I say so," he snapped before disappearing around the corner. Kiana's heart sank deeper as she leaned her head against the wall, the cold concrete biting into her scalp. She thought of her mom waiting at home, probably worried sick by now. Elise worked nights too at a factory across town, and Kiana was supposed to text her when she got in safe. She hadn't had the chance. Her phone was still in her backpack, somewhere in evidence, or maybe Stokes had smashed it just for kicks, she didn't know. Desperation clawed at her chest as she replayed the night again, trying to find some way out. Some crack in their story. She could exploit. Her alibi was airtight. If they'd just look. But Stokes had made it clear they wouldn't. He'd forged that witness statement, planted that knife. He was building a cage around her brick by brick, and she didn't know how to break free. Her thoughts spiraled darker with each passing minute. What if they didn't let her call anyone? What if they buried her in some cell and threw away the key? Her dreams of Tuskegee, of staring up at the stars through a telescope on some quiet campus lawn, felt like a cruel joke now. All she could see was the blood on that knife, the sneer on Stokes's face, the way he'd called her a thug, like it was her name finally. After what felt like an eternity, the cell door creaked open and an officer gestured for her to step out. "One." "Caller," he grunted, pointing to a battered payphone mounted on the wall. Kiana stumbled forward, her legs numb from sitting so long. Her fingers shook as she dialed her mum's number. The line crackled, and Elise picked up on the second ring, her voice. "Frantic Kiana, baby, where are you? What's going on?" Kiana opened her mouth to explain, but before she could get more than a few words out, Stokes appeared out of nowhere, his shadow looming over her. He slammed the receiver down, cutting off Elise. Mid-sentence, his grin was pure malice as he leaned in close enough for her to feel his breath on her cheek. "Don't worry," he whispered. "You'll have plenty of time to talk in prison." Kiana's blood ran cold as he stepped back, laughing to himself, while Jenkins watched from the corner, his face pale and uneasy. She was marched back to the cell, her chance at help snuffed out before it could even begin. The door slammed shut again, sealing her in with nothing but her fear and the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Kiana Marshall shuffled into the swelteringly unbearable Birmingham courtroom, her grease-stained diner uniform clinging to her skin like a second layer of shame. The air felt thick enough to choke on 98 degrees of stagnant heat pressing down from the ceiling, where a single rickety fan spun lazily. Not doing a damn thing to ease the suffocation, sweat dripped down her temple, stinging her eyes as she tried to hold her head high, despite the weight of the last 12 hours bearing. Down on her soul, the cuffs were off, now replaced by the invisible chains of a system that had already branded her guilty. Her sneakers scuffed against the worn wooden floor as a bailiff with a face like stone guided her to a splintered chair beside. Her public defender, a scrawny man with a cheap suit and a nervous tic, who hadn't even bothered to introduce himself properly. Yet the courtroom buzzed with whispers from the gallery, where a handful of spectators sat fanning themselves with folded newspapers, their eyes boring into her back, like she was some kind of exhibit at a zoo. Up on the bench sat Judge Vernon Holt, a silver-haired relic of a man with a face carved from granite and eyes as cold as a winter midnight. His gavel rested on the polished wood in front of him, but he didn't need it to command the room. His presence alone sucked the air out, leaving nothing but dread in its place. Kiana's stomach churned as she caught his gaze for a split second, those icy eyes slicing through her like she was nothing more than a bug under a magnifying glass. He adjusted his black robe with a slow, deliberate motion, his lips curling into a sneer that made her blood run cold, even in the oppressive heat. She tried to focus on breathing, on keeping her hands steady in her lap, but her fingers wouldn't stop trembling, not when every fiber of her being screamed that this wasn't just a hearing, it was a trap. The prosecutor, a wiry woman with sharp cheekbones and a voice like a whip, stood up, her heels clicking on the floor as she began laying out the charges with a dramatic flair that felt more like theater than justice. Armed murder of a respected shop owner, terrorizing the community, fleeing the scene when police arrived. Her words painted Kiana as a violent menace, a predator who'd left a trail of blood and chaos in her wake. Never mind that Kiana had never even been in a fight, let alone held a knife. Her record was spotless, a straight A student who spent her nights scrubbing dishes to save for college. But the prosecutor didn't mention any of that, didn't care about her time cards or the diner footage that could prove she'd been nowhere near that shop. Instead, she leaned hard into the forged witness statement Stokes had slapped together, her voice rising as she waved the paper like a flag, claiming it was airtight proof of Kiana's guilt. Kiana's chest tightened with every word, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to process the lies piling up around her. She wanted to scream that none of this was true, that she'd been pouring coffee for truckers while that shop owner bled out 3 streets over, but her public defender, a man who'd finally mumbled his name as Gavin Price, just sat there scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen scratching so loud it grated on her nerves. He didn't look at her, didn't reassure her, just kept his head down like he was already defeated before the fight even started. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up, his voice shaky as he tried to argue for a delay. "We need time to gather evidence, Your Honor. Surveillance footage from the diner, time cards, witnesses who can place my client at work during the alleged crime." But Holt cut him off mid-sentence, his gavel slamming down with a crack that echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Evidence." The judge barked, his voice booming over the murmurs in the gallery. The victim's family identified the defendant. "The witness statement is clear. Your client's a danger to society and I won't have it in my city." Kiana's heart sank to the pit of her stomach, her vision blurring as the weight of his words hit her. The family identified her how when she'd never even met them? The witness statement was a lie. Stokes had admitted as much with that smug grin back at the precinct, but Holt wasn't interested in questions or truth. His mind was made up before she'd even stepped foot in the room. She couldn't hold it in any longer. Her voice burst out raw and desperate. "I was at work. You can ask my manager, Big Ray. He'll tell you." Holt's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing into slits as he leaned forward in his chair. "Silence," he roared, his voice a thunderclap that made the bailiff step closer, like he was ready to drag her out right then and there. "You speak when I tell you to speak, girl." Kiana flinched at the venom in his tone, the way he spat out "girl," like it was a slur all its own. Her cheeks burned with shame and rage, but she clamped her mouth shut, knowing another word might bury her deeper than she already was. Gavin tugged at her sleeve, hissing under his breath to stay quiet, but it didn't matter. Holt wasn't done. He straightened up in his seat, smoothing his robe again as if wiping away the inconvenience of her existence. And then in one swift, cruel moment he delivered his ruling. "No bail. The defendant will await trial in Ironwood Juvenile Detention." He paused, his sneer twisting into something uglier as he added, "I'll see to it you learn your place." Kiana's world tilted, the words slamming into her. Like a freight train 5 seconds ago, she'd been clinging to the hope of going home, sleeping in her own bed, even if it meant house arrest. But now that hope was ash. Ironwood wasn't just a detention center. It was a fortress. A place where kids, Went in and came out broken if they came out at all. Her breath caught in her throat, a sob clawing its way up, but she swallowed it down, refusing to let Holt see her crack. The gallery erupted into whispers, some shocked, some angry. But nobody stood up, nobody fought for her. As the bailiffs grabbed her arms, their grip bruising her already sore skin, she caught a glimpse of a juror in the back row, a middle-aged woman with tight curls and a pinched face who looked away quickly like she couldn't bear to meet Kiana's eyes. But as the bailiffs yanked her toward the side door, the woman slipped a folded piece of paper into Kiana's hand, her fingers trembling as she whispered so soft it was almost lost in the chaos. "They're all in on it." Kiana's heart stuttered as she clutched the note in her fist, her mind racing with questions. Who were they? What did they want? Why her? But the bailiffs didn't give her time to think. They dragged her through the door, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor as the courtroom faded behind her. The note burned in her palm, a tiny spark of something, maybe hope, maybe warning. But either way, it was all she had left as the heavy steel door of the transport van slammed shut, sealing her in darkness. She couldn't shake the image of Holt's sneer, the way his eyes had gleamed with something darker than justice. She didn't know what waited for her at Ironwood, but if the juror was right, if they were all in on it, then this wasn't just a mistake. It was a conspiracy, and she was the target. The van lurched forward, its engine growling as it carried her away from the courthouse, and toward a future she couldn't begin to imagine. Her fingers tightened around the crumpled note, her only lifeline in a world that seemed hell-bent on breaking her down. If you're sick of seeing innocent kids like Kiana get railroaded by a system that's supposed to protect them, drop a number 1 in the comments, and let's hear your thoughts on this. Injustice, smash that like button and hit subscribe to join the fight for truth, because every voice counts now. What do you think Kiana's going to face in Ironwood when the whole system's already stacked against her? Stick around to find out in the next part, because it's about to get even uglier. The transport van rattled over potholed roads, its engine growling like a beast, as Kiana Marshall sat shackled to a metal bench, her wrists raw from the cuffs that bit deeper with every jolt. The air inside was thick with the stench of rust and sweat, the 90-degree Birmingham heat, turning the steel box into an oven that baked her alive. Her grease-stained diner uniform clung to her skin, the fabric stiff with dried perspiration and the faint tang of fryer oil. She clutched the juror's crumpled note in her fist, its edges damp from her clammy palm. "They're all in on it." The words looped in her mind, a haunting refrain that drowned out the van's groans, but offered no answers, just more questions. Who were they? Why her? What did they want from a 17-year-old girl who only wanted to study stars? The van lurched to a stop after what felt like hours, the heavy doors screeching open to reveal Ironwood Juvenile Detention, a fortress of cracked concrete squatting under. A bruised grey sky barbed wire glinted atop towering fences, catching the last fading rays of sunlight like jagged teeth. The air outside wasn't much cooler, heavy with the smell of diesel and decay as 2 guards hauled her out, their grips bruising. Her arms, one of them a squat man with a buzz cut, and a sneer muttered something about teaching her kind of lesson, his voice low enough to pretend she wasn't meant to hear it, but loud enough to make sure she did. Her sneakers scuffed against the gravel as they marched her through a rusted gate, its hinges screaming in protest. The courtyard beyond was a barren stretch of dirt and broken asphalt, littered with cigarette butts and faded graffiti. Inside the main building, the walls were a sickly yellow, stained with years of neglect. The fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, casting flickering shadows that danced on the scuffed linoleum floor. Kiana's heart pounded as she was shoved into a processing room where a hulking man in a too-tight uniform waited behind a desk. His name tag read Warden Curtis Bragg, and his eyes were the kind of empty that made her skin crawl. He stood slowly, his chair creaking under his weight, his lips curling into a smile that held no warmth. Well, he drawled, his voice a gravelly rasp that scraped against her nerves. "Look what we got here, a little troublemaker. Thinks she's too good for the rules." He leaned forward, his meaty hands splaying on the desk as he sized her up, his gaze lingering on her uniform like it was proof of something vile. Kiana straightened her spine, refusing to let him see her fear. "I didn't do anything," she said, her voice steady even as her knees trembled. "I shouldn't be here." Bragg laughed, a sharp bark that echoed. Off the concrete walls, you'll learn quick enough, girl. This ain't a place for shoulds and shouldn'ts. This is Ironwood, you do what I say, or you don't make it out. He nodded to the guards, who grabbed her again, dragging her down a narrow hallway, lined with steel doors, each one marked with scratched initials and faded curses. They stripped her of her belongings, tossing her backpack into a bin with a clang, then shoved her into a communal shower, the water ice-cold and reeking of mildew as they barked at her to scrub faster when she was done. They threw her a threadbare grey jumpsuit, its fabric rough against her skin, and marched her to her cell, a 6x8 box with a rusted bunk and a toilet that stank of piss. The door slammed. Shut behind her, the sound final as a gunshot. Her cellmate, a wiry girl with a shaved head and a scar slicing across her eyebrow, looked up from the bottom bunk. Her name was Tasha. She didn't smile, didn't offer a hand, just nodded once and said, "Keep your head down and you might survive this place." "Bragg don't play, he's got a thing for girls like us." Kiana swallowed hard the weight of Tasha's words. Sinking in like lead, girls like us. Black girls, defiant girls. Girls who didn't fit. The mold they wanted crushed. She climbed onto the top bunk, the mattress thin as paper and smelling of mold, her body aching from the day's ordeal. But sleep wouldn't come, not with the flickering lights and the distant shouts echoing through. The halls the next morning, Bragg made good on his threat. He singled her out at roll call, his voice booming over the line of girls in the swelteringly unbearable courtyard, marshal front and center. "You think you're special, don't you? Let's see how special you feel after a day on scrub duty." He handed her a bucket and a rag, the water inside sloshing grey and foul, then pointed to the cracked asphalt stretching across the yard. "Clean it all, every inch." The sun was already climbing high, the temperature soaring past 100 degrees by noon as Kiana knelt on the burning ground, her knees bruising against the rough surface. The rag tore at her palms, leaving them raw, and bleeding guards circled her like vultures, their boots kicking dust into her face as they taunted her with slurs, calling her filth, and worse, one of them, a lanky man with a crooked nose, spat at her feet, his laughter sharp as broken glass. "You missed a spot," he sneered, kicking over her bucket so the dirty water soaked her jumpsuit. Kiana bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction, but inside she was screaming, her body screaming louder as the heat sucked the strength from her limbs. By dusk, her hands were blistered, her back a knot of pain, but Bragg wasn't done. He stood over her as the other girls shuffled back inside his shadow, swallowing her whole. "You got a problem with hard work?" he asked, his tone daring her to speak up. She shook her head, her throat too dry to form words. "Good," he said, "then you won't mind doing it again tomorrow." Tasha caught her in the hall after lights out, her voice a harsh whisper as she pressed a torn piece of paper into Kiana's hand. "Use this to write down what they do to you. Bragg's got special punishments for girls who fight back. Keep it hidden or you're done." Kiana nodded, slipping the paper under her mattress, her heart racing as she scratched out the day's horrors with a smuggled pencil stub, the blisters, the slurs, the spilled bucket. Every word felt like defiance, like a tiny spark of power in a place designed to snuff her out. But 2 nights later, as she wrote under the dim glow of a stolen flashlight, a guard caught her, his flashlight beam pinning her like a spotlight on a stage. He ripped the paper from her hands, tearing it into confetti as he laughed. "You think you're slick, don't you?" He dragged her from the cell, her bare feet scraping the cold floor, and threw her into solitary, a pitch-black closet. Barely 3 feet wide with no window, no bunk, just a bucket in the corner, and a concrete floor that bit into her skin as she curled into a ball. The door slammed shut, the lock clicking with a finality that made her chest ache. 3 days, he growled through. "For the slot you'll learn to keep your mouth shut." Kiana pressed her forehead to the ground, her breath hitching as the darkness closed in. Her notebook was gone, her spark snuffed out. All she had left was the memory of Tasha's warning and the cold certainty that Bragg wouldn't stop until she broke the hours stretched into eternity, the unchanging blackness, making it impossible to tell day from night. Her stomach growled, her throat burned, but the guards gave her nothing, not even a sip of water to ease the ache. She whispered constellations to herself, Orion, Cassiopeia, Ursa Major, tracing their shapes in her mind to keep from losing it. But even the stars couldn't drown out the sound of Bragg's laugh echoing in her head, or the fear that this was only the beginning. Kiana Marshall stumbled out of solitary confinement after 3 endless days, her legs trembling like a newborn foal, as the dim light of Ironwood Juvenile Detention's hallway stabbed at her eyes. Her grey jumpsuit hung loose on her frame, the fabric damp with sweat and streaked with grime from the concrete floor that had been her bed. Her throat felt like sandpaper. Every swallow, a scrape of pain from the lack of water the guards had given her, nothing but a single stale cracker tossed through the slot, like she was a stray dog they wanted to toy with before kicking aside her blistered hands. Shook as she clutched the wall for support, the rough cinder block scraping against her raw palms as she tried to steady herself against the dizziness swirling in her skull. The memory of her torn notebook still burned in her chest, each shredded page a piece of her defiance scattered like ash. But worse than the loss of her words was the weight of despair that had settled into her. Bones' 3 days in that pitch-black closet had stretched into an eternity, leaving her hollow and haunted by the echo of Warden Curtis Bragg's laughter. "You'll learn to keep your mouth shut," he'd said, and now as she squinted into the flickering, fluorescent light she feared he might be right. Her cellmate Tasha was waiting by the door, her scarred eyebrow raised in a silent question, but her eyes softened when she saw the state Kiana was in. "You made it," Tasha whispered, slipping a crust of bread into Kiana's trembling hand. "Eat slow or you'll puke." Kiana nodded, her throat too raw to speak, as she nibbled the stale crust, the faint taste of mold barely registering against the hunger gnawing at her gut. She sank onto the bottom bunk, her body screaming in protest as the thin mattress offered little comfort. Tasha sat beside her, keeping watch as the other girls shuffled past, their whispers buzzing like flies around a carcass word had spread about Kiana's punishment, and the fear in their glances told her Bragg's message had landed loud and clear. Don't fight back, don't speak up, or you'll end up like her. But outside Ironwood's barbed wire walls, something was stirring. Kiana's mother, Elise. Marshall had spent those 3 days rallying a small crowd of neighbors and co-workers, their voices raw from shouting as they stood outside the detention center's gates in the blistering Birmingham heat, 95 degrees, with no shade in sight. Their signs scrawled in black marker on cardboard screamed "Justice for Kiana" and "Free our kids." The words catching the eye of a local news van parked across the street. The reporter, a young woman with sharp cheekbones and a microphone clutched tight, filmed Elise as she spoke, her voice trembling with fury. "My daughter's innocent," she said, tears streaking her face. "She was at work when they say that murder happened. They won't even look at the proof. The footage, the witnesses, nothing." The story aired that night. On Channel 7, the grainy broadcast cutting through the humid evening air and catching the attention of a Birmingham lawyer named Nadia Wells, a 32-year-old black woman who'd spent her career fighting for kids chewed up by the system. Nadia sat in her cramped downtown office, the glow of her laptop screen casting shadows on the stacks of case files around her. As she watched Elise's plea, her jaw tightened with every word. This wasn't just another case. This was a war she knew. The diner footage Elise mentioned could be a lifeline if it still existed. She called Elise that night, her voice steady but urgent. "I'm taking Kiana's case, pro bono. We're getting that footage and we're getting her out." Elise sobbed into the phone, her relief palpable as she clutched her cracked cell phone like a prayer answered. Nadia wasted no time. She drove to the diner that same night, the neon sign flickering above the entrance as Big Ray, the manager, handed over the security. Footage from the night of the murder. The grainy video showed Kiana pouring coffee, wiping down tables and counting tips, her every move, time-stamped clear as day. Nadia clutched the USB drive like it was gold, her heart racing with the first reel. Hope she'd felt since watching the news she filed for an emergency hearing. The next morning, her heels clicking on the courthouse steps as she marched in with the evidence burning a hole in her briefcase, Kiana was pulled from her cell at dawn, the guards' rough hands yanking her up before she'd even had a chance to eat the watery oatmeal they'd slapped on her tray. They didn't say where they were taking her, just shoved her into a van and drove her back to the same swelteringly unbearable courtroom where Judge Vernon Holt had crushed her dreams days before her stomach churned. As she stepped inside, the air still thick with the stench of old wood and despair. But this time, Nadia was there. Her crisp blazer, a stark contrast. to Kiana's faded jumpsuit, her eyes fierce with determination, as she whispered to Kiana, "We've got this, I've got the footage, you're going home soon." Kiana dared to hope, her chest loosening for the first time in days, as she sat beside Nadia. Her bruised hands hidden beneath the table, Holt took the bench, his silver hair gleaming under the courtroom lights, his sneer as cold as ever. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, annoyance, maybe even unease, as Nadia stood to present her motion. "Your Honor, we have definitive proof of my client's whereabouts during the alleged crime," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs in the gallery security footage from the diner, time-stamped and verified, showing Kiana Marshall working a double shift, miles from the crime scene. "I request an immediate dismissal of all charges." Holt's sneer twisted into a scowl, his fingers tightening around his gavel. As Nadia handed the USB drive to the bailiff, the screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life, showing Kiana wiping down a sticky table at 9:37 p.m., the exact time the shop owner was bleeding out 3 streets. Over the gallery, gasped whispers, rippling through the crowd as the truth played out in grainy black and white. Kiana's eyes burned with unshed tears, her heart hammering with the possibility of freedom. She glanced at Nadia, who gave her a small nod, her lips curving into the faintest smile. But Holt wasn't moved. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain as he cut Nadia off mid-sentence. "This footage is inconclusive." He barked, his words slamming into Kiana like a brick wall. "The timestamps could be tampered. The witnesses unreliable. I won't have this court turned into a circus over shoddy evidence." Kiana's hope shattered, her breath catching in her throat as the room spun around her. Nadia argued, her voice rising with controlled fury. "The footage is verified by the diner's security company. The timestamps are digitally logged." But Holt waved her off like she was a fly buzzing too close to his face. "The victim's family identified the defendant," he said, his tone final. "The witness statement places her at the scene. That's enough for me." He paused, his eyes locking onto Kiana with a malice that made her skin crawl, then added in a voice low and deliberate, "And frankly, I've got new evidence of my own. Your client's been tampering with witnesses, trying to intimidate them into changing their stories." Kiana's blood ran cold as Holt slid a piece of paper across the bench, a supposed affidavit signed by an anonymous witness claiming Kiana had sent threats from Ironwood. Her jaw dropped, the accusation so absurd it felt like a fever dream. "I've been locked up," she stammered. "I haven't talked to anyone." Holt's sneer deepened silence. He snapped, "You'll speak when I tell you to speak, girl." Nadia gripped Kiana's arm under the table, her fingers tight as she whispered, "Don't give him the satisfaction, but the damage was done." Holt leaned back in his chair, his decision already made. "New charges will be filed for witness tampering," said the defendant. "Remains a danger to society. She stays in Ironwood until trial, no bail, no exceptions." He slammed his gavel down, the sound, a gunshot that echoed in Kiana's skull as the bailiffs grabbed her again, their hands bruising her arms as they dragged her back toward the van. Nadia called after her, "We'll fight this, Kiana, I swear." But her voice faded into the chaos of the gallery as the door slammed shut behind her. The van's engine roared to life, carrying her back to Ironwood, her fleeting glimpse of freedom snuffed out like a candle in a storm. The affidavit was a lie. She knew it had to be another of Stokes's forgeries, planted to keep her buried. But knowing didn't change the fact that Holt had bought it hook, line and sinker. As the van rattled over the same potholed roads, Kiana's mind raced with the bitter truth: the system wasn't broken. It was built this way, and she was just another casualty caught in its gears. If you're enraged by a judge like Holt ignoring clear evidence to keep an innocent girl locked up, drop a number 1 in the comments to show you're standing with Kiana. Hit that like button and subscribe to see this fight for justice unfold. Because every second counts. Now, what do you think Ironwood has in store for Kiana? When the warden gets word of this failed hearing, brace yourself for the next part, because it's going to hit harder than ever. Kiana Marshall sat in the back of the transport van, her wrists cuffed tight enough to bruise as it rattled back toward Ironwood juvenile detention. The Birmingham heat still clung to her skin, 94 degrees, even as the sun dipped below the horizon. Her grey jumpsuit was soaked with sweat, the fabric sticking to her thighs like a second skin after the swelteringly unbearable courtroom had crushed her fleeting hope of freedom. The memory of Judge Vernon Holt's sneer burned in her. Mind his voice echoing like a curse as he'd slapped on new charges of witness tampering and sent her straight back to this hellhole. The forged affidavit, a lie cooked up by Detective Lamar Stokes, felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Every pothole the van hit jolted her bruised body, a reminder of the 3 days in solitary that had already left her weak and hollow. Her stomach growled a sharp pang that twisted through her ribs, but the guards up front didn't care. They laughed over some crude joke, their voices grating as they tossed slurs into the air like confetti, calling her kind troublemakers who deserved worse than Ironwood could dish out. The van screeched to a halt outside the detention center's rusted gates, the barbed wire glinting under floodlights, as Kiana was yanked out into the muggy night air, her sneakers dragged across the gravel, her legs still shaky from hunger and exhaustion. Warden Curtis Bragg was waiting in the courtyard, his hulking frame silhouetted against the cracked concrete wall, his meaty arms crossed over his chest, and a smirk twisting his lips into something feral. He'd seen the news, the failed emergency hearing, the diner footage that didn't matter to Holt, and now his eyes gleamed with a vicious kind of glee as the guards shoved Kiana toward him. Well, he drawled, his voice a low growl that scraped against her nerves. Looks like you thought you could play hero, get your mama on TV and make me look bad. You're gonna learn, girl. Nobody crosses me without paying a price. Kiana's heart thudded against her ribcage, her mouth dry as ash as she tried to meet his gaze without flinching. I didn't do anything, she said, her voice cracking from disuse. I just want to go home. Bragg laughed, to sound like breaking glass as he stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her whole. His breath reeked of stale tobacco and spite. You don't get it, do you? He said, leaning in so close she could see the veins spidering across his nose. This ain't about what you did. It's about what you are troublemakers like. You gotta be taught a lesson, and I'm real good at teaching. He straightened up, barking an order to the guards who grabbed her arms, their fingers digging into her already bruised skin before dragging her toward the yard the next morning. Bragg made good on his threat. He orchestrated what he called a yard incident, gathering a group of girls known for their loyalty to him, their eyes hard and empty as they circled Kiana under the blazing midday sun, 103 degrees, the heat shimmering off the asphalt in waves that distorted the air like a mirage. The guards stood back, their batons dangling lazily at their sides, as Bragg nodded to the ringleader, a stocky girl with a shaved head and a sneer that matched his own. Teach her what happens when you stir up trouble, he said, his voice carrying over the yard like a death knell. The girl cracked her knuckles, her fists slamming into Kiana's stomach before she could even brace herself. The blow doubled her over, air rushing out of her lungs in a choked gasp. As she dropped to her knees, the asphalt searing her palms like hot coals, the other girls joined in their kicks, landing hard against her ribs, the crack of bone echoing in her ears as pain exploded through her chest. She tried to crawl away, her nails clawing at the ground, but they dragged her back, their laughter sharp and cruel as they took turns. One of them stomped on her hand, grinding her fingers into the pavement until she screamed, her voice raw and broken. The guards watched the whole time, their faces blank, except for the occasional smirk. One of them, a lanky man with a crooked nose, muttered loud enough for her to hear. Should have known her place. Maybe this'll teach her. Kiana's vision blurred, tears mixing with sweat, as the beating stretched on the pain, a white-hot haze that swallowed her whole. When they finally stopped, her ribs ached with every shallow breath, blood trickling from a split lip down her chin. The guards stepped in, then, claiming she'd started the fight, their report already written before the first punch landed. Bragg loomed over her as she lay crumpled on the ground, his boots inches from her face. Looks like you're a danger to others, he said, his tone mockingly official. That's another 2 weeks. Added to your sentence, maybe more, if you don't behave. Kiana barely heard him over the ringing in her ears, her body a map of bruises and broken bones as they dragged her to the infirmary. The nurse, a tired woman with graying hair, didn't even look at her as she taped up her ribs, muttering about how girls like her always caused trouble. Kiana lay on the cracked vinyl cot, her breath hitching with every movement, as the pain settled into a dull roar that wouldn't let her rest. Her mind drifted to her mother Elise, to the protest she'd seen on the news. Before Holt crushed her hope, maybe there was still a chance, maybe someone would listen, but the thought felt fragile, like a glass figurine teetering on the edge of a shelf that night, back in her cell. Tasha slipped her a burner phone during laundry. Duty her movements quick and silent as she pressed the battered Nokia into Kiana's hand. "Got it from a girl who got out last week," Tasha whispered. "Use it quick before they catch you." Kiana nodded, her heart racing, as she tucked the phone into her jumpsuit, the plastic warm against her skin after lights out. She hid under her thin blanket, her fingers trembling as she dialed Elise's number. The line crackled, and her mother's voice came through frantic and tear-soaked. "Kiana, baby, are you okay? What's happening?" Kiana's voice broke as she whispered through sobs. "They beat me. Mama broke my ribs. I don't know how much more I can take." Elise's breath hitched on the other end, her words fierce despite the fear. "I'm getting you. Count, I swear I'll find a way, just hold on." But before Kiana could say more, the door to her cell creaked open. A guard's flashlight beam slicing through the darkness like a blade caught her phone's glow. He stormed in, ripping the Nokia from her hands and smashing it against the wall, the pieces scattering across the concrete like broken promises. Bragg appeared behind him, his hulking frame filling the doorway, his face a mask of rage. "You think you can sneak around behind my back?" roared his voice, shaking the walls. He grabbed her arm, yanking her out of bed despite her cracked ribs, the pain flaring white-hot as she stumbled after him. He dragged her down a narrow stairwell to a basement cell, a dank concrete box with no windows, just a rusted radiator bolted to the wall. He chained her to it, the metal cuffs biting into her wrists as the cold seeped into her bones. "You'll stay here till you learn," he growled, slamming the door shut with a clang that echoed in the dark. Kiana slumped against the wall, her ribs screaming with every breath, the darkness pressing in like a living thing. As the hours stretched into forever, her mother's voice still lingered in her ears, a faint spark of hope in a world that seemed determined to crush it. But with Bragg's fury unleashed, that spark felt further away than ever. Kiana Marshall slumped against the icy concrete wall of the basement cell, her cracked ribs screaming with every shallow breath as the rusted radiator cuffs bit into her wrists. The air down here was thick with the stench of mold and despair. 90 degrees outside, but somehow colder than death in this windowless tomb. Warden Curtis Bragg had left her chained like an animal, his parting words echoing in her skull. "You'll stay here till you learn." Her body ached from the beating in the yard, her swollen hand throbbing where one of the girls had stomped it into the pavement. Blood still crusted her split lip, the metallic tang lingering on her tongue as she tried to focus on anything but the pain. The darkness pressed in, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the faint drip of a leaky pipe. Somewhere in the corner she'd lost track of time, hours, maybe days since Bragg had dragged her down here after smashing the burner phone, her one lifeline to her mother Elise. The memory of Elise's voice, frantic and fierce through the crackling line, was all that kept her from breaking completely. "I'm getting you out, I swear, just hold on." Kiana clung to those words like a lifeline, whispering them to herself as her bruised body shivered against the cold. But outside Ironwood's barbed wire walls, the world was shifting. Elise Marshall had spent every waking moment since that call, fighting for her daughter, her feet blistered from pacing Birmingham's cracked sidewalks, her voice hoarse from shouting at protests that grew larger. With each passing day, she'd rallied neighbors, co-workers, even strangers who'd seen the news about Kiana's case. Their signs now painted in bold red and black, demanding justice for a girl they'd never met, but whose story hit them like a punch to the gut. Elise's hands trembled as she dialed a number she hadn't called in years, her estranged ex-husband Roland Marshall, the U.S. Attorney General, who'd walked out on them after a bitter divorce a decade ago. Her pride screamed at her to hang up, but her love for Kiana screamed louder. Roland picked up on the third ring, his voice clipped and formal, until Elise's sobs broke through the line. "Our baby's in trouble," she said, her words spilling out like a dam bursting. "They've got her locked up in Ironwood, beat her, broke her ribs, framed her for a murder." "She didn't do, Roland, you gotta help me." His silence stretched for a heartbeat, then another, before his tone shifted. "Sharp as a blade, I'll be there by morning," he said, and hung up, true to his word. Roland Marshall arrived in Birmingham at dawn, his sleek black SUV cutting through the humid haze like a shark through water. He stepped out in a tailored suit, his polished shoes gleaming against the dusty pavement, his presence crackling like a summer storm. as he strode into the federal courthouse downtown. His reputation preceded him. The man who'd taken down cartels and corrupt senators with a ruthlessness that made even the hardest criminals sweat. But this wasn't about politics or headlines. This was personal. His daughter, his blood, was rotting in a cage, and he'd tear the whole damn system apart to get her out. He didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't wait for an appointment. He marched straight to Judge Vernon Holt's chambers, his security detail trailing behind like shadows. Holt was mid-sip of his morning coffee when Roland burst through the door, the cup clattering to the desk as the judge's sneer faltered for the first time in years. Holt wiped a bead of sweat from his silver brow, trying to regain his composure as Roland loomed over him, his voice low and lethal. "Release my daughter now." Holt leaned back in his leather chair, his sneer returning, though it trembled at the edges. "Mr. Marshall," he said, his tone dripping with false bravado, "this is my courtroom. Your position holds no authority here. I've seen the evidence. She's a danger to society, and she'll stay where she belongs." Roland's eyes narrowed to slits, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Holt whole. "My position may not," he said, each word a shard of ice, "but my power does. I'll dismantle your entire career, piece by piece, if you don't let her go today." Holt's knuckles whitened on the arms of his chair, panic flickering behind his cold gaze, but he doubled down, his voice rising an octave. "You can't intimidate me. I've got jurisdiction here." Roland didn't blink. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than any shout. "Then you won't mind if I give this case my personal attention." He straightened up, adjusting his cufflinks with a deliberate calm that made Holt's sneer slip again, remove the defendant. Holt barked at his bailiff, his voice cracking as he tried to salvage control, but the weight of Roland's stare was a promise. "This isn't over." Roland didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and left the courthouse, his mind already racing through legal maneuvers as he filed a federal injunction that afternoon, pulling strings only a man in his position could touch. The injunction hit like a thunderclap, ordering Kiana's temporary release from Ironwood pending a review of her case by a federal judge. The news reached the detention center by evening, Bragg's face twisting into a mask of rage as he read the court order, his fists crumpling the paper like it was Roland's throat. But he had no choice. The feds were watching now. Kiana was pulled from the basement cell at dusk, her chains clanking as the guards unlocked her from the radiator. Her legs barely held her as she stumbled up the narrow stairwell, her vision swimming from dehydration and pain. The fluorescent lights of the main hall burned her eyes as Bragg stood by the exit, his hulking frame blocking the door like he could stop this with sheer spite. "You'll be back," he growled as she passed. "You ain't getting away that easy." Kiana didn't look at him, didn't dare speak as the feds escorted her to a waiting SUV, her cracked ribs aching with every step. The Birmingham night air hit her like a balm, warm and sticky but free of Ironwood's stench. For the first time in weeks, she stepped out into the courtyard, her sneakers crunching on gravel as Roland waited by the vehicle, his tailored suit a stark contrast to her faded jumpsuit, his face unreadable until she got closer. Then his mask cracked, his eyes softening with something raw as he opened his arms. Kiana fell into them, her bruised body trembling as she let herself break, for the first time since this nightmare began. Her sobs muffled against his chest as he held her tight. His voice, low and fierce, "I've got you, baby girl, I've got you." She was free, at least for now, her hollow eyes scanning the horizon as the SUV pulled away, Ironwood's barbed wire fading into the dusk behind her. For the first time in weeks, she dared to believe this might be the end of her torment. The system had bent just a little, and with her father's power behind her, maybe she could finally go home. But deep down, a gnawing fear whispered that Bragg and Holt weren't the kind to let a loss go unanswered. They'd come for her again. She felt it in her bones, and this time they'd hit harder than ever before. If you're cheering for Roland stepping in to save his daughter from a corrupt system, like Holt's, drop a #1 in the comments to show your support. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how this battle unfolds, because justice is on the line now. What do you think Holt and Bragg will do to strike back at Kiana and her father? After this courtroom showdown, stay tuned for the next part, because the storm's only just beginning. Kiana Marshall sat in the back seat of the sleek black SUV, her cracked ribs aching with every bump as the vehicle rolled through Birmingham's dimly lit streets. The 90-degree heat lingered even at dusk, the air sticky with humidity that seeped. Through the cracked window, her grey jumpsuit had been swapped for a borrowed t-shirt and jeans from her mother Elise, but the fabric still scratched against her bruised skin. Her father, Roland Marshall, sat beside her, his tailored suit pristine. Despite the chaos of the day, his jaw tight as he stared out at the passing city lights, his presence a steady anchor in the storm that had upended her life. She clutched her hands in her lap, her swollen fingers throbbing where Ironwood's girls had stomped them into the pavement. The memory of Warden Curtis Bragg's parting words echoed in her skull. "You'll be back. You ain't getting away that easy." His sneer had been a promise, not a threat, and it gnawed at her even now as the distance between her and that concrete fortress grew. Roland had secured her temporary release with a federal injunction, pulling strings only a U.S. Attorney General could touch. But temporary wasn't free. Not really. She was on house arrest, now an ankle, monitor strapped tight around her leg, its plastic band itching against her skin, a constant reminder that Holt and Bragg weren't done with her. Not by a long shot. The SUV pulled into a modest motel on the edge of town, a safe haven Roland had arranged until they could sort out the next steps. The neon sign flickered in the humid night, casting a sickly green glow over the cracked parking lot as Roland helped her out of the car, his grip gentle but firm on her arm. His security detail fanned out around them, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of trouble inside. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener. But it had a bed, a shower, and a door that locked three things Kiana hadn't realized she'd missed. So much until they were gone. She sank onto the sagging mattress, her body screaming in protest, as Roland sat across from her in a creaky chair, his voice low and steady. "We're gonna fix this, Kiana. I promise." But her mind was already spinning with fear because Holt and Bragg weren't the kind to let a loss slide. They were vipers coiled tight, waiting for the right moment to strike, and that moment came faster than anyone expected back in his chambers. Judge Vernon Holt sat hunched over his mahogany desk, his silver hair gleaming under a brass lamp as he scrolled through encrypted emails on a burner laptop. His sneer twisted into something uglier than usual as he read the news of Kiana's release. His knuckles whitened around a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid trembling as he gripped it too tight. Roland Marshall had humiliated him in his own courtroom, a federal injunction slapped down like a guillotine, cutting through his carefully laid plans Holt had spent decades building. A network of cronies who owed him favors, judges, cops, private prison execs, all feeding into a system that kept kids like Kiana locked up and his pockets lined. But Roland's interference threatened to unravel it all. He couldn't let that stand. Beside him, Warden Curtis Bragg paced the room, his hulking frame casting jagged shadows on the walls, his face flushed red with rage as he growled about teaching that girl a lesson. Once and for all, Holt raised a hand, silencing him mid-rant. "We don't touch her yet," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. "We hit her where it hurts her name, her family. We bury her in lies so deep even her daddy can't dig her out." Bragg nodded, his sneer matching Holt's as they set their plan in motion within hours. They'd orchestrated a smear campaign that spread like wildfire. Holt's contacts in private prisons, cronies, who profited off every black kid they could lock up, funneled cash to a shady media fixer who doctored footage of Kiana in Ironwood, the grainy video manipulated to show her screaming threats at guards, her voice dubbed over with a chilling confession to the shop owner's murder. "I did it. I'd do it again." The words were fake, but they sounded real enough to fool anyone who didn't. No better. The fixer leaked the footage to a national tabloid known for its sensationalist headlines. "Teen killer confesses inside Ironwood." The story exploded online within hours, hashtags trending as trolls and bots amplified the lie until it drowned out the truth by morning. The headlines screamed across every newsstand and social media feed branding Kiana, a violent predator who'd played the system to walk free. Protesters swarmed the motel where Roland had set up his temporary base, their shouts echoing through the thin walls as Kiana peered through the blinds, her heart slamming against her cracked ribs. The crowd wasn't like the ones her mother had rallied. These weren't supporters. They were angry strangers waving signs that called her a murderer, a thug, a danger to society. Some hurled racial slurs, their voices raw with hate, as they threw bricks through the motel windows, the glass shattering with a crash that made Kiana flinch, her breath catching in her throat as Roland pulled her away from the window, his security detail barking orders into radios to secure the perimeter. One brick landed inches from her feet, a jagged shard of glass slicing her shin as she stumbled back. The pain, a sharp sting that brought tears to her eyes. But worse than the cut was the weight of the lies piling up around her. She wasn't just fighting for freedom anymore. She was fighting for her name, her humanity. Everything they were trying to strip away Roland's face was a mask of fury as he dialed his team. His voice clipped as he demanded a federal investigation into the footage. But the damage was done. Public opinion had turned the tabloid story, picked up by every major outlet, until even the local news ran segments questioning Roland's integrity, accusing him of abusing power to free a guilty daughter. Kiana's stomach churned as she watched the broadcasts on the motel's fuzzy TV, her face plastered across the screen alongside the fake confession. Her swollen hand trembled as she clutched the remote, unable to look away from the nightmare unfolding in real time. But Holt and Bragg weren't done. Their next move hit even harder. Detective Lamar Stokes, the same cop who'd planted the bloody knife in Kiana's backpack, slunk into Elise Marshall's neighborhood under the cover of night, his unmarked car idling outside her cramped apartment while she worked the late shift at the factory. Stokes slipped into her unlocked garage, his gloved hands planting a baggie full of cocaine in the glove box of her beat-up sedan. He called in an anonymous tip to the precinct, claiming he'd seen drug deals going down at the address within hours. Birmingham PD swarmed the apartment, kicking down the door with a battering ram. As neighbors watched from their porches, Elise arrived home just as they dragged her out in cuffs, her work uniform still dusted with factory grime. As they shouted about possession with intent to distribute, she screamed her innocence, her voice raw as they shoved her into a cruiser. But the drugs were real enough to book her, the arrest hitting the news cycle by morning. Mother of teen killer busted for drugs. The headlines sneered, tying Elise's fate to Kiana's in a twisted knot of lies. Kiana saw the report on the motel TV, her heart plummeting as her mother's mugshot flashed across the screen, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Kiana's breath hitched a sob, clawing its way up her throat as she turned to Roland. "They got Mama," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What do we do now?" Roland's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists as he stared at the screen. "We fight," he said, his voice steel. But Kiana could see the cracks in his armor, the strain of a war that kept escalating beyond his control with Elise locked up, and the world turned against them. Kiana was alone now, truly alone. The motel room felt smaller than ever, its walls closing in as death threats began to pour in online and over the phone. Cowards, hiding behind burner numbers, promising to finish what Ironwood started. Her ankle monitor beeped softly, a mocking reminder that even out here she wasn't free. Holt and Bragg had struck back with a vengeance, their lies sharper than any baton, and now with her mother in chains and her name dragged through the mud, Kiana felt the weight of their hatred, like a physical thing pressing her down until she could barely breathe. Kiana Marshall sat holed up in the cramped motel room, her swollen hand trembling as she gripped a burner phone Roland had slipped her after the bricks crashed through the windows the night before. The graffiti-scarred walls of the room seemed to close in tighter with every passing hour. The Birmingham heat still lingered at 92 degrees, even as dusk painted the sky a bruised purple through the jagged hole. Where the glass used to be, her ankle monitor beeped faintly under the borrowed jeans, a mocking rhythm that echoed the death threats pouring in online. Cowards, calling her a killer, a thug promising to hunt her down now that her name was poison. The TV flickered in the corner, its fuzzy screen replaying her mother Elise's mugshot, her eyes wide with exhaustion after Detective Lamar Stokes had framed her with drugs. The headline, "Mother of teen killer busted for drugs," looped endlessly, a dagger twisting deeper into Kiana's chest. With every cycle, Roland paced the room, his tailored suit rumpled for the first time since he'd stormed into Birmingham. His jaw clenched tight as he barked orders into his phone, demanding federal agents trace the doctored footage that branded Kiana a murderer. But the world outside didn't care about evidence, not anymore. Holt and Bragg had turned her into a monster in the public's eyes, and with Elise locked up in county jail, Kiana was alone, truly alone. Her cracked ribs ached as she hunched over the motel's wobbly table, her mind racing for a way out, any way to fight back. She couldn't just sit here waiting for the next blow. Not when her mother's freedom, her family's name, her entire future hung in the balance. She thought of the coding club she'd joined. At school last year, the late nights learning to hack databases for fun, a skill she'd never imagined needing until now. Her fingers hesitated over the burner phone's cracked screen. Then, moved with a sudden resolve, she dialed into a sketchy app she'd used back then, bouncing her signal through proxies to mask her location. Her breath hitched as she typed, accessing a dark web forum where Birmingham PD's dirty secrets sometimes surfaced. She wasn't a hacker, not really, but she knew enough to dig, and tonight she'd dig until her hands bled. Stokes had planted that knife forged, that witness statement framed her mother. She'd bet her life he'd left a trail somewhere. Her heart pounded as she scrolled through encrypted threads, her swollen fingers clumsy on the tiny keys, until she stumbled on a leaked email thread buried in a whistleblower's dump. The sender's address was scrambled, but the recipient was clear. Stokes leapt Govorg. Her pulse spiked as she opened it. The messages detailing payments from Judge Vernon Holt to Stokes' cash, funneled through offshore accounts labeled juvenile quotas. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Holt wasn't just corrupt. He was running a racket with private prisons. Every black kid locked up meant more money in his pocket, and Stokes was his enforcer. Kiana's vision blurred with rage as she read on one email, even mentioned her by name, Marshall Girls a perfect target, pin the shop murder on her, and we hit R. Numbers. Her stomach churned, the cold truth sinking in like ice. This wasn't random. They'd chosen her because she was black, because she was expendable, because she fit their sick game. She screenshot the emails, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped the phone, then sent them to Nadia Wells, the pro bono lawyer who'd fought for her in court. Nadia's response came fast. A single text: "We've got them leaking this. Now." Kiana's chest loosened for a split second, a flicker of hope sparking. Through the despair, maybe this could turn the tide. Maybe the truth could still win. Nadia didn't waste time. She forwarded the emails to Maya Carter, a Birmingham journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption. Maya worked through the night, her fingers flying over her laptop in a cluttered newsroom as she pieced together the story. She dug deeper, unearthing financial records, whistleblower testimony, even a grainy photo of Holt shaking hands with a private prison exec at a fundraiser. The exposé dropped online at dawn, titled "Birmingham's Juvenile Injustice Scandal, Judge Holt Implicated in Quota Scheme." The article exploded across social media, the leaked emails front and center as proof of Holt's racket, hashtags like "Justice for Kiana." And the quota trended within hours. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, their chants shaking the muggy morning air as Birmingham woke to the ugly truth. Kiana watched it unfold on the motel TV, her breath catching as Maya's voice narrated the broadcast linking Holt to private prisons and Stokes to the frame-up. The public's rage was palpable, a wave crashing against the lies Holt and Bragg had built. Roland stood beside her, his face a mask of grim satisfaction as he muttered, "They're cornered now." The pressure forced Holt to recuse himself from Kiana's case that afternoon, his silver hair slick with sweat as he stormed out of his chambers. Barking at aides to shred files, a new judge, a stern woman named Clara Evans, took over her reputation for fairness. A stark contrast to Holt's venom, she granted Kiana a retrial scheduled for the next week, citing overwhelming evidence of misconduct. Kiana's heart leapt, her cracked lips parting in a shaky gasp as Roland squeezed her shoulder. His voice steady. "We're getting there, baby girl." She felt victory within reach for the first time since this nightmare began. The motel room suddenly brighter. Despite its peeling paint and broken windows, the protests outside grew louder, their chants a lifeline pulling her from the abyss. She dared to imagine going home, hugging her mother, walking free. Her name cleared her dreams of Tuskegee, alive again, but that hope lasted less than an hour. Stokes wasn't cornered, not yet. He'd seen the exposé, knew the walls were closing in, and he wasn't about to let some 17-year-old girl take him down. As Kiana left the motel for the Retrial hearing escorted by Roland's security detail. Stokes waited in the shadows, his unmarked car parked across the street from the courthouse, his gloved hands gripped a taser, its prongs gleaming under the dashboard light as Kiana stepped. Onto the sidewalk, her sneakers scuffing against the cracked pavement. He moved fast, slipping through the crowd like a ghost, his face a mask of cold fury. Roland's agents were too busy scanning for bigger threats to notice the lone cop closing. In Stokes lunged, his taser crackling as it hit Kiana's side, sending 50,000 volts through her body. Her knees buckled, a scream tearing from her throat as she crumpled to the ground, her vision flashing white with pain. The crowd scattered, their shouts turning to panic as Stokes loomed over her, his breath hot against her ear. "You think you're smart, huh?" he hissed. "This ain't over yet." Her body convulsed, the electric shock searing through her cracked ribs as Roland's agents finally reacted, tackling Stokes to the pavement, his taser skittering across the asphalt. But the damage was done. Kiana lay gasping, her swollen hand clawing at the ground as the world spun around her. The retrial papers clutched in her other fist, now crumpled and stained with sweat. Stokes's attack was a warning, a brutal reminder that Holt's machine wouldn't die quietly. Her brief taste of victory soured into terror as the agents dragged her to safety, her father's voice roaring orders over the chaos. She'd exposed their racket turned the tide, but they'd hit back harder than ever, and now she knew they'd stop at nothing to bury her again. If you're fired up about Kiana fighting back against a corrupt system with nothing but her wits, drop a number 1 in the comments to stand with her. Smash that like button and subscribe to catch every twist in this battle, because the truth's worth fighting for now. How far do you think Stokes will go to silence Kiana? After this desperate ambush, hold tight for the next part, because it's about to get downright savage. Kiana Marshall lay sprawled on the cracked Birmingham sidewalk, her body twitching from the taser's electric jolt. As Roland's security agents wrestled Detective Lamar Stokes to the ground, his snarling face pressed against the asphalt, her cracked ribs burned with every gasping breath, the pain a searing wildfire that spread through her chest as she clawed at the pavement, her swollen fingers leaving streaks of sweat and dirt. The retrial papers she'd clutched fluttered away in the humid breeze, 91 degrees even at dusk, the air thick enough to choke on as the crowd's panicked shouts echoed around her. Stokes had ambushed her outside the courthouse, his taser crackling with 50,000 volts, a desperate bid to silence her after she'd exposed his racket with Judge Vernon Holt. The leaked emails tying them to private prison quotas had turned the tide, but Stokes wasn't going quietly. His voice still hissed in her ears from moments ago. "You think you're smart? Huh, this ain't over yet." The words dripping with venom as Roland's agents pinned his arm, snapping cuffs around his wrists with a metallic clank. Kiana's vision swam, her head pounding as she tried to sit up, her t-shirt clinging to her sweat-soaked skin. The ankle monitor beeped faintly, a cruel reminder of her fragile freedom. Roland knelt beside her, his tailored suit scuffed with dirt as he gripped her shoulders, his voice sharp with fear. "Kiana, stay with me, baby girl." Help's coming. His security team radioed for medics, their voices overlapping in a chaotic blur as sirens wailed in the distance. But Stokes wasn't done. Even as the agents dragged him away, he twisted his head back, his eyes locking onto Kiana with a glare that promised blood. "You're dead," he spat. "I'll make sure of it." The threat sank into her bones, heavier than the taser's sting, because she knew he meant it. Stokes wasn't just a crooked cop, he was a cornered animal, and animals like that didn't stop until they'd torn everything apart. The medics arrived minutes later, their red lights flashing across the courthouse steps as they strapped Kiana to a stretcher, her body limp with exhaustion as they checked her vitals. Her pulse raced under their fingers, her cracked ribs shifting painfully with every jolt of the gurney. Roland followed close, his jaw tight, as he barked at his team to secure the scene, his phone already pressed to his ear, demanding federal backup. Stokes was hauled into a cruiser, his sneering face pressed against the glass as it pulled away, leaving Kiana trembling on the stretcher, her mind racing with the certainty that this wasn't the end, not even close. The ambulance sped through Birmingham's tangled streets, its siren slicing through the muggy night as Kiana stared at the ceiling, her breath shallow and ragged. The medic, a young woman with tight braids, muttered about possible internal bleeding, her hands steady as she adjusted an oxygen mask over Kiana's face. But Kiana barely heard her. Her thoughts spiraling back to the ambush, the taser's crackle Stokes' promise of revenge. She'd thought exposing Holt's racket would save her, but it had only painted a bigger target on her back. The ambulance screeched to a halt outside a hospital, its emergency bay buzzing with staff, as they rushed her inside, the fluorescent lights blinding her as they wheeled her into a curtained room. Roland stayed by her side, his presence a storm of fury and fear. Thaz doctors swarmed around her, stitching the gash on her shin from the motel brick, taping her ribs with cold precision. But the hospital wasn't the end of Stokes' plan. It was just a detour. He'd slipped a burner phone to a crony before his arrest, a wiry man with a shaved head who'd melted into the courthouse crowd after the attack. The crony drove an unmarked van through Birmingham's industrial district, its tires humming over cracked asphalt as he dialed Stokes' next move. The plan was already in motion. Stokes had stashed a can of gasoline in the van's back days earlier, its fumes sharp and acrid as the crony sped toward an abandoned warehouse on the city's edge, a crumbling brick relic surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted machinery. He parked under a sagging awning, its shadow swallowing the van as he dragged Kiana's location from a hacked police radio. She was still in the hospital, but Stokes had ordered her moved somewhere quieter, somewhere he could finish what he'd started. The crony broke into the warehouse, its shattered windows gaping like empty eyes as he hauled Kiana inside her body, limp from the stretcher transfer. Roland's agents had been distracted by hospital chaos, a paperwork mix-up orchestrated by Holt's last loyal clerk, giving Stokes' man the window he needed. Kiana's wrists were zip-tied to a rusted pipe, her ankles bound tight with duct tape as she slumped against the cold metal, her cracked ribs screaming. With every breath the crony loomed over her, his shaved head gleaming with sweat as he doused the floor with gasoline, the liquid splashing across the warped wooden planks, its stench choking the air. He pulled a lighter from his pocket, its flame flickering as he ranted in Stokes' voice, keeping her kind in check. He said his words, a twisted echo of every slur she'd heard since this nightmare began. Kiana's heart slammed against her ribcage, her swollen hand tugging uselessly at the zip ties as the gasoline pooled around her sneakers, her mind racing for a way out, any way to survive. She thought of her mother, Elise, locked up on fake charges of Roland, fighting a system that kept bending but never breaking. The flame danced closer, her breath hitching as the heat kissed her skin. She screamed, her voice raw and desperate. But the warehouse was miles from help, its walls swallowing her cries like a tomb. Just as the crony flicked the lighter toward the floor, a crash shattered the silence. Roland's FBI team stormed in their boots, pounding the wood as flashlights cut through the dark. Maya Carter, the journalist who'd broken Holt's scandal, had tracked Kiana's ankle monitor signal after a tip from Nadia, the lawyer she'd called Roland. The second she'd traced it to this nowhere spot, the agents tackled. The crony mid-act, his lighter skittering across the floor as they pinned him down. His curses muffled against the planks, Roland burst through the door, his tailored suit torn at the sleeve as he ran to Kiana, his hands shaking as he cut the zip ties. With a pocket knife, she collapsed into his arms, her body racked with sobs as the gasoline fumes stung her eyes. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice breaking as he held her tight. The agents dragged the crony away, his shaved head slamming against the doorframe as he thrashed. But the victory was short-lived back at the courthouse. Holt used his last shred of influence, bribing a junior judge with a fat envelope slipped under a desk. The retrial was postponed indefinitely, the order citing security concerns after the warehouse incident. Kiana's stretcher was wheeled back to Ironwood under protective custody, the judge claiming it was for her own safety, but Roland knew better. It was Holt's final play to keep her caged. Bragg was waiting at the gates, his hulking frame silhouetted against the floodlights as the van pulled up, his sneer wider than ever. "Welcome back, girl," he said, his voice dripping with malice as the guards yanked her inside. Kiana's heart sank, her brief taste of freedom snuffed out like a candle in a storm. The hospital, the warehouse, the FBI rescue. It had all been a cruel tease now. She was back in Bragg's hands, his sadistic grin promising a hell worse than anything she'd faced before her. Cracked ribs throbbed as they shoved her into the same dank cell block, her sneakers scuffing the concrete, As Roland's shouts faded behind the steel door, she'd survived Stokes's fire, but Holt's machine had pulled her back into the abyss, and this time she wasn't sure she'd make it out. Kiana Marshall stumbled into Ironwood Juvenile Detention's dank cell block, her cracked ribs flaring with every step as the steel door slammed shut behind her, the clang echoing like a death knell in the 90-degree Birmingham night warden Curtis. Bragg loomed at the gate, his hulking frame silhouetted against the floodlights, his sneer stretching wide as he barked at the guards to shove her harder. Her sneakers scuffed the grimy concrete, her borrowed jeans snagging on a rusted bolt as they dragged her back to the same 6x8 cell she'd escaped days ago. The air reeked of piss and mildew, the walls scarred with scratches from girls who'd come before her, now faded into silence. Her ankle monitor was gone, traded for Ironwood's shackles, but the weight of her return pressed heavier than any plastic band Judge Vernon Holt's bribe had yanked her retrial away, sentencing her back to this hellhole under protective custody, a lie so thin she could see the malice glinting through it. Bragg's voice rumbled as he followed her in. "Welcome back, girl. You thought you'd slip away, didn't you?" His tone dripped with venom, a promise of pain that made her stomach twist her cellmate. Tasha looked up from the bottom bunk, her scarred eyebrow twitching as she took in Kiana's bruised face and taped ribs. "You okay?" Tasha whispered. But Kiana couldn't answer, her throat too raw from screaming in that warehouse, her body too broken from Stokes's gasoline-soaked trap. She sank onto the top bunk, the thin mattress creaking under her weight as she curled into a ball, her swollen hand throbbing where the zip ties had cut into her wrists. The next morning, Bragg wasted no time. He stormed into the cell block at dawn, his boots pounding the floor like a war drum as he yanked Kiana out by her arm. Her ribs jolted with a sharp stab of pain that made her gasp. "You're on my turf. Now." He growled, his breath hot with stale coffee, as he dragged her to the mess hall. The other girls averted their eyes, their trays clattering softly as Bragg announced her punishment. "Marshall's been causing trouble, so she gets nothing. No food, no water, till I say otherwise." Kiana's stomach growled, a hollow ache that had gnawed at her since the hospital. But Bragg wasn't done. He forced her to drink from a rusted pipe in the corner, its water brown and bitter with sediment that coated her tongue like sludge. She gagged, her cracked lips splitting wider as she choked it. Down the guards laughed, their voices sharp as broken glass as they leaned against the wall, one of them muttering loud enough for her to hear. Should have burned up in that warehouse. Maybe next time Kiana's knees buckled, but she stayed upright, her defiance flickering like a dying flame, as Bragg watched her with those empty eyes, his hulking frame. A mountain she couldn't climb. 3 days passed, with nothing but that foul water, her stomach shrinking into a tight knot, her vision blurring. As hunger clawed at her insides, her taped ribs ached with every breath, a constant reminder of the yard beating that had cracked them open. Bragg wasn't satisfied with starvation, though on the 4th day he staged a riot in the courtyard. Sun blazing down at 102 degrees as he ordered the guards to unlock the gate and step back. A group of girls, hand-picked for their loyalty to him, circled Kiana, their fists clenched tight as Bragg barked, "Go on, show her what happens when you cross me, the ringleader." A wiry girl with a shaved head and a snarl lunged, first her baton stolen from a guard cracking against Kiana's shin, the pain a white-hot burst that dropped her to the asphalt. The others joined in their blows, raining. Down like hail, one slammed a fist into her taped ribs, the crack of bone snapping anew as Kiana screamed, her voice hoarse and ragged. The guards filmed it, their phones held high as they grinned, capturing every hit to prove she's dangerous. Bragg's voice boomed over the chaos. "That's right, make it good." The footage would bury her deeper. They'd claim she'd started it just like last time. Kiana curled into a ball, her arms shielding her head as kicks landed on her back, her legs, her swollen. Hand blood trickled from her nose, pooling on the burning pavement, as the beating stretched on her vision, fading to black at the edges. When they finally stopped, she couldn't move her body, a crumpled heap of bruises and broken bones, as the guards dragged her to solitary, the same pitch-black closet she'd survived before the door slammed shut, with a finality that shook her core. But Tasha hadn't given up on her that night. During a laundry shift, she slipped a shiv into Kiana's hand, a jagged piece of metal wrapped in cloth, her whisper urgent, "Keep it hidden, use it if you have to." Kiana nodded her trembling fingers, tucking it into her jumpsuit. The cold steel, a faint spark of power in a place designed to strip it away. She clutched it tight as they shoved her back into solitary. The darkness swallowing her whole 3 days later, a guard caught her with it, his flashlight beam pinning her as she adjusted her grip. He ripped it from her hand, his laugh a guttural snarl as he dragged her out by her hair. "You're done now," he said, tossing her into a deeper cell, a concrete box with no light, no sound, just a rusted bucket in the corner. And a month-long sentence scratched onto the wall. Kiana slumped against the cold stone, her taped ribs splintered further from the riot, her swollen hand useless as she traced the wall with her nails, her breath shallow and ragged as the hunger, the pain. The isolation clawed at her mind. She was at her breaking point, her body a wreck, her spirit fraying at the edges, but she refused to let Bragg win. Not yet, she whispered constellations to herself. Orion, Cassiopeia, Ursa, Major, her voice a cracked thread in the dark, tracing their shapes in her mind to keep from losing it entirely. She scratched escape plans into the concrete with a broken fingernail, every jagged line a promise to herself that she'd get out, that she'd fight her. Way back to the stars she'd dreamed of studying at Tuskegee. The hours bled into days, the unchanging blackness making time a cruel illusion. Her stomach twisted with hunger, her throat burned with thirst, but the guards gave her nothing. Her whispers grew fainter, her strength ebbing as the walls closed in tighter. Roland's team wasn't idle, though they'd uncovered Bragg's footage from the staged riot. The grainy video leaked to Nadia Wells, who passed it to Maya Carter, the journalist. Maya aired it on a late-night broadcast. Birmingham's Ironwood exposed guards film brutal. Beating the public erupted protests swelling outside the detention center as Roland filed federal charges against Bragg, demanding Kiana's release. But Bragg was one step ahead. He burned the evidence in his office, the tapes curling into ash in a metal trash can, as he smirked at the rising smoke. "You can't prove nothing," he muttered to himself. The charges stalled without hard proof, leaving Kiana trapped in solitary, her escape plans scratched deeper into the wall, her whispers fading to silence as her body gave out. She slumped to the floor, her cracked ribs pressing against her lungs, her swollen hand limp at her side. The constellations, blurred in her mind, replaced by Bragg's sneer. Stokes's threat, Holt's gavel. She'd survived the warehouse, the taser, the riots. But this might be the end. Her last thought before the darkness took her was of Roland, his voice promising. He'd get her out, a promise she wasn't sure he could keep anymore. Kiana Marshall lay crumpled on the cold concrete floor of Ironwood Juvenile Detention's deepest solitary cell, her cracked ribs stabbing her lungs with every shallow breath. As the darkness pressed in like a living thing, her swollen hand hung limp at her side. The jagged scratches of her escape plans etched into the wall above her, now blurred through a haze of hunger and pain. The Birmingham night outside simmered at 90 degrees, but down here in this windowless tomb the air was stale and suffocating thick with the stench of rust and despair. Warden Curtis Bragg had left her here a month ago, after catching her with Tasha's shiv, his hulking frame filling the doorway as he'd barked, "You're done now." His sneer, a promise of annihilation she'd survived on nothing but drips from a rusted bucket, the water brown and bitter her stomach, a hollow pit that gnawed at her insides. Her taped ribs splintered further from the staged riot. Her body a map of bruises and broken bones that screamed with every twitch, but her spirit clung to life by a thread fueled by whispered constellations, and the faint echo of Roland's voice promising he'd get her out. She'd stopped counting the days, the unchanging blackness making time a cruel trick. Her mind teetered on the edge of breaking the stars she'd traced to stay sane, fading into Bragg's laugh, Stokes's threats, Holt's gavel. But something snapped inside her that night. A storm rolled over Birmingham, its thunder, rumbling through the concrete walls like a call to war. Rain lashed the detention center's roof, seeping through cracks to drip onto her face. The cold drops jolting her awake from the stupor that had claimed her. Her swollen hand twitched as she pushed herself up, her cracked ribs grinding against each other with a pain that made her gasp. But she gritted her teeth, her defiance flaring like a match in the dark. She wasn't dying here, not like this, not while Holt and Bragg still breathed. Free air. Her trembling fingers fumbled along the wall, tracing the scratches she'd made weeks ago. A jagged map of pipes and vents she'd overheard guards mention during a shift. Change her breath hitched as she found a loose bolt in the rusted frame of the door, its edges sharp enough to cut. She worked it free, her nails splitting as she twisted it loose, the metal clinking softly against the concrete as she gripped it like a lifeline during the storm's chaos. A guard fumbled his keys. Outside the cell block, the clatter muffled by the howling wind. Kiana seized the moment, her swollen hand shaking, as she jammed the bolt into the lock and twisted with all the strength she had left. The mechanism groaned, then clicked, the door creaking. Open an inch as lightning flashed through a distant window. She slipped out her sneakers, silent on the wet floor, her heart slamming against her cracked ribs as she darted down the narrow hall. The storm masked her escape thunder, drowning out the squeak of her shoes as rain poured through a busted skylight, soaking her jumpsuit and stinging her cuts. She moved fast, her mind a blur of adrenaline and instinct, ducking past a guard station where a lone man slept. His head slumped over a soggy sandwich, his flashlight rolling on the desk. She grabbed it, its beam cutting through the shadows as she navigated the maze of corridors, her escape plans coming alive with every step. She reached a service vent near the laundry room, its grate loose from years of neglect. Her swollen hand bled as she pried it open, the metal scraping her knuckles raw, but she squeezed through the tight space, her cracked ribs scraping against the edges with a pain that nearly blacked her out. The vent led to an outer wall, its exit hidden by overgrown weeds lashed by the storm. She tumbled out into Birmingham's underbelly, the rain a cold slap against her bruised face as she staggered to her feet, her breath ragged but free. She ran, her sneakers slipping in the mud as thunder rolled overhead, her body screaming but her will unbreakable. She found a condemned motel 3 miles away, its neon sign long dead, the windows boarded up with rotting plywood. She broke in through a loose plank, her flashlight beam dancing over peeling wallpaper and moldy carpet. Her cracked ribs throbbed as she collapsed onto a mildewed mattress, her swollen hand clutching the flashlight like a talisman. She'd made it out alive, but she knew Bragg would come for her. Holt too, their machine wouldn't let her slip away so easy outside Ironwood. Roland's team hadn't stopped fighting. Maya Carter, the journalist who'd exposed Holt's racket, tracked Kiana's escape through a tip from a whistleblower guard who'd seen her slip the vent. Maya found her at the motel at dawn, her boots crunching on broken glass as she pushed through the door. "Kiana, you're alive," she said, her voice a mix of relief and urgency. "We're ending this now." Maya set up a live broadcast from the motel room, her phone propped on a cracked table as she narrated Kiana's story to the world, her lens capturing Kiana's bruised face, her taped ribs, her swollen hand, the rain-soaked jumpsuit clinging to her frame. "This is what they did to her," Maya said, her voice steady but fierce. "Framed her, locked her up, tried to kill her all to keep their quotas alive." The broadcast streamed to millions, the shaky footage cutting through Birmingham's morning haze as Kiana spoke, her voice raw but unbroken. "They beat me, starved me, chained me, but I'm still here. I won't stop fighting." The words hit like a bomb. Protests erupted outside Holt's estate, their chants shaking the humid air as federal agents swarmed in. Roland had pushed every lever he had left, the live feed giving him the ammo to force a raid. Holt was caught mid-act, his silver hair wild as he shredded files in his study, his hands trembling as agents kicked down the door, his offshore accounts tied to the shop owner's family flashed across Maya's broadcast. The final nail in his coffin, he was cuffed, his sneer gone, replaced by a panicked grimace as they dragged him out. Bragg was next, his hulking frame pinned against Ironwood's gate as feds stormed the facility, his sneers turning to curses as they hauled him away. The evidence Maya aired was overwhelming. Bank records, emails, testimony, all linking him to Holt's scheme. Kiana's charges were dropped that afternoon, the new judge, Clara Evans, signing the order with a steady hand. As Roland's SUV screeched into the motel lot, he burst through the door, his tailored suit soaked with rain as he pulled Kiana into his arms, her bruised body trembling as she collapsed against him, her sobs muffled in his chest. "I'm free," she whispered, her voice breaking with relief. He held her tight, his own voice cracking. "You're safe now, baby girl. I've got you." The motel's broken walls faded into the background as the storm quieted outside. Birmingham's streets alive with the sound of justice rolling in Holt and Bragg were gone. Their machine shattered by a 17-year-old girl who'd refused to break. Kiana's flashlight flickered out on the table, its battery dead. But she didn't need it anymore. The dawn light crept through the boarded windows, a faint promise of a new day. She'd survived the riots, the warehouse, the starvation, and now she stood tall. Her name cleared her mother's arrest under review as Roland vowed to free Elise next. The fight wasn't over, not entirely, but for the first time in months, Kiana felt the weight lift. Her cracked ribs still ached, her swollen hand still throbbed, but she'd won this round her escape. Her voice, her truth had torn their world apart, and as she leaned against Roland, the motel's mildew stench fading into the rain, she dared to dream again of Tuskegee, of stars, of a future they couldn't steal. Kiana Marshall stood in the damp motel room, her cracked ribs aching as the Birmingham dawn crept through the boarded windows, its faint light cutting through the mildew stench that clung to the peeling walls. Her swollen hand rested on the cracked table where her dead flashlight lay, a relic of her escape from Ironwood juvenile detention. The rain had stopped the storm's roar, fading into a quiet hum as Roland Marshall held her close, his tailored suit soaked from the dash through the downpour, his arms a fortress around her bruised body. Her sobs had softened into shaky breaths, her voice a whisper against his chest. "I'm free." The words felt fragile, like they could shatter if she said them too loud. Roland's grip tightened his own voice, cracking with relief. "You're safe now, baby girl, I've got you." The motel's sagging mattress creaked as she sank onto it, her borrowed jeans stiff with mud from her run through the city's underbelly. Her taped ribs throbbed with every movement. A dull roar that reminded her of the riots, the starvation, the warehouse fire she'd survived. Judge Vernon Holt and Warden Curtis Bragg were in cuffs, their corrupt machines shattered by her escape, and Maya Carter's live broadcast the new judge. Clara Evans had dropped her charges hours ago, the ink still wet on the order. As Roland's SUV idled outside, ready to take her home, Elise's arrest was under review, her mother's freedom, the next battle Roland vowed to win. But for now, Kiana let herself breathe the air sharp with the promise of a new day. She'd won her name, cleared her future. Hers again, she pictured Tuskegee University, its quiet campus lawns and star-filled skies, a dream she could finally chase. Her swollen hand twitched as she imagined holding a telescope mapping constellations, like she'd whispered to herself in solitary Orion Cassiopeia. Ursa Major. They'd kept her sane. Now they'd guide her forward. Roland sat beside her, his polished shoes scuffing the moldy carpet as he rubbed her back, his voice steady. "We'll get you settled, get you healed, then you're going to that school. I'll make sure of it." Kiana nodded, her cracked lips parting in a faint smile. The first she'd felt in months. Her mind drifted to the broadcast, Maya's phone capturing her bruised face, her raw truth tearing Holt's world apart, the protests outside his estate, the feds kicking down his door. It was over, she'd beaten them, her 17-year-old defiance, stronger than their decades of power. She closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion pull her under the weight of survival, lifting just enough to let her rest. But that rest didn't last long. 2 weeks later, Kiana stood on Tuskegee's campus, her sneakers sinking into the soft grass as she clutched her acceptance letter. The ink smudged from her sweaty palms, the September heat hovered at 88 degrees, a gentle breeze rustling the oak trees overhead. Her taped ribs still ached, but the swelling in her hand had faded to a dull bruise. She'd enrolled in the astronomy program. Her first classes starting that morning, her dorm room a tiny haven with a desk, a bed, and a window that framed the Alabama sky. Roland had made good on his promise, pulling strings to fast-track her admission. After the nightmare she'd endured, Elise was free too. Her drug charges dropped when Stokes's planted cocaine was traced back to his own stash, a confession beaten out of him in federal custody. Kiana smiled as she thought of her mother back home in Birmingham, rebuilding their life one factory shift at a time. The scars of Ironwood lingered, her nightmares filled with Bragg's sneer, Stokes's taser, Holt's gavel. But she was here, standing tall, her future unfolding like a star chart. She could finally read. She spent her nights in the campus observatory, her eye pressed to a telescope's lens, tracing the Milky Way's spiral arms. her cracked ribs a distant ache as she scribbled. Notes on graph paper. Her professors praised her quick mind, her resilience whispering about the girl who'd survived hell to chase the stars, but Kiana didn't want praise. She wanted purpose. She started a non-profit in her spare time. Justice Beyond. Bar's a scrappy group of students and activists fighting for kids, wrongfully locked up like she'd been. Her inbox overflowed with letters from Ironwood detainees, their shaky handwriting begging for help. She read everyone, her swollen hand steady. Now as she typed replies promising to fight for them, Tasha's letters came too, her cellmate still trapped in that concrete fortress, her words sharp and urgent. You got out. Don't forget us. Kiana didn't forget. She worked late into the night, her dorm lamp casting shadows on the walls as she drafted legal petitions, her astronomy homework piled beside her laptop, the stars and the fight blending into one relentless mission. Her first rally came a month later. A small crowd gathered on Tuskegee's quad, their signs scrawled with "Free the Innocent" and "End the System." Kiana stood at the podium, her voice steady despite the tremor in her taped ribs. I was one of them, she said, her words cutting through the humid air. Locked up for a crime I didn't commit, beaten, starved, nearly burned alive, but I'm here because I fought, and I'll fight for every kid still trapped in that system. The crowd cheered, their claps a thunder that echoed her heartbeat. Roland watched from the back, his suit crisp again, his eyes glinting with pride as she spoke. Her non-profit gained traction, donations trickling in from strangers who'd seen Maya's broadcast. She hired a lawyer, a young black woman named Aisha, who'd grown up in Birmingham's projects, her fire matching Kiana's, as they filed cases for Tasha and others. The work was grueling, but it fueled her. Every win, a star added to her chart. Every loss, a reminder of why she couldn't stop. 2 years later, Kiana stood at her graduation, her cap tilted slightly, her diploma clutched in her healed hand. The May sun blazed at 93 degrees, sweat beading on her forehead. As she crossed the stage, her name rang out over the speakers. Kiana Marshall, Bachelor of Science in Astronomy. The crowd roared. Roland and Elise in the front row, their faces wet with tears as she waved her taped ribs. A faint memory, now her non-profit had freed 12 kids in those 2 years, Tasha among them, her scarred eyebrow raised in a grin as she hugged Kiana after the ceremony. You did it, girl, Tasha said, her voice rough but warm. Kiana smiled, her eyes stinging with pride. Not just for me, she said, for all of us. Her first case as a graduate was a class action lawsuit against the private prison company that had profited from her pain. Aisha by her side as they filed the papers, their evidence a mountain of leaked emails, testimony footage, the same tools she'd used to topple Holt, now aimed at the system's roots. The fight stretched into months, then years. Kiana's nights split between stargazing and strategy, her telescope lens tracing novas as her laptop screen glowed with legal briefs. She spoke at rallies across Alabama, her voice a beacon for kids still caged. Her non-profit grew a national name, Justice Beyond Bars, a force the system couldn't ignore. But on the night of her biggest rally yet, 3 years after graduation, the air shifted. Kiana stood on a Birmingham stage, her sneakers planted firm as 5,000 people filled the square, their signs a sea of color under the 90-degree dusk. She wore a crisp blazer, now her taped ribs long healed, her swollen hand a memory as she gripped the mic. I'm not here just for me, she said, her voice booming over the crowd. I'm here for every kid still trapped in that system. We've freed dozens, but dozens more need us. The fight isn't over, it's just beginning. The crowd roared, their energy a tidal wave that lifted her up. She scanned their faces, her heart swelling with the fire of purpose, until a red dot danced across her chest, a sniper's laser glinting in the twilight. Her breath caught her eyes darting to the rooftops as the crowd's cheers turned to screams. Roland lunged from the sidelines, his tailored suit ripping at the seam as he tackled her to the stage, the crack of a gunshot splitting the air. The bullet grazed his shoulder, blood blooming red against his white shirt as he shielded her. The crowd scattered, their shouts a chaotic blur as Roland's security team swarmed the stage. Kiana's heart slammed against her ribs, her healed hand clutching his arm as medics rushed in. He grunted. Through the pain, his voice steady. Stay down, Kiana, I'm okay. The sniper vanished into the night, his shot a warning, not a kill, traced later to Holt's son, Vernon Jr., a 28-year-old white supremacist who'd escaped the raids 3 years ago. His father's arrest had fueled a vendetta, a twisted legacy of hate, now aimed at Kiana's heart. Roland survived the surgery that night, his shoulder patched with stitches as he lay in a hospital bed, his eyes fierce despite the morphine. "I won't let them touch you," he said, his hand gripping hers. Kiana trembled, her blazer stained with his blood, as she nodded, her voice a whisper. "We keep fighting." The sniper's red dot lingered in her mind, a ghost that wouldn't fade. Holt was gone, Bragg too, but their poison ran deeper than she'd known, racism's roots twisted through generations, unbroken by courtroom wins or prison reforms. She stood by Roland's bedside, her healed hand steady now, her cracked ribs a distant scar, but her resolve burned brighter than ever. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Her father's blood on her hands was proof of that, a grim reminder that every star she chased came with a shadow she couldn't outrun. Kiana stepped back into the night, her blazer discarded, her sneakers scuffing the hospital lot as she looked up at the stars. Orion gleamed faint against the city glow, a promise and a challenge she'd fight on for Tasha, for Elise, for every kid still caged her non-profit. Her voice, her life, a weapon against the dark, because even with Holt and Bragg gone, the system's heart still beat and she'd tear it out one star at a time. Kiana Marshall's journey teaches us resilience in the face of unrelenting injustice. Her story exposes the brutal reality of systemic racism, where corrupt figures like Judge Vernon Holt and Warden Curtis Bragg wield power to crush the innocent for profit. It's a stark reminder that justice isn't guaranteed. It's fought for, often at a steep personal cost. Kiana's escape from Ironwood and her fight to clear her name show that courage can spark change, even when the odds seem impossible. Her use of technology, hacking to uncover truth, highlights how ingenuity can turn victims into warriors. Yet the sniper attack by Holt's son reveals a chilling lesson. Racism's roots run deep, pass through generations, and dismantling it requires more than one victory. Roland's sacrifice underscores the strength of family as a shield against hate, while Kiana's nonprofit, Justice Beyond Bars, proves that surviving isn't enough. Lifting others is the real triumph. This tale urges us to question who the system serves and to recognize that freedom demands vigilance. Kiana's stars, whispered in darkness, symbolize hope's endurance, teaching us that even in our lowest moments, purpose can light the way. The fight against prejudice isn't over. It's a relay, and we're all runners. What do you think? Can one person's defiance topple a corrupt system, or does it take a movement? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if Kiana's fight inspires you, and subscribe for more stories of justice. Share this to keep the conversation alive. Thanks for joining us. Here's to a world where truth prevails.